Hey, good morning, and thank you for the introduction there, Ajit. As you mentioned, NUAIR manages and operates the FAA designated test site here in New York. But our topic today is informing legal and regulatory process. Sometimes the most interesting aspect of the UAS space, sometimes the most frustrating piece. With me, I have two people joining me today. I have Zaida McGhee, founding partner at Angulo McGhee law firm, and Tyler Hazen, also partner at Angulo McGhee. And maybe, Zaida, you can give yourself a brief introduction and some background here before we get started.
Sure. I started my legal career in the aviation department of a law firm, and I have had a passion for aviation law ever since, and that has just increased with the development of drones. Um, Tyler and I are the authors of Drone Law, which we understand to be the first drone law book in the United States that's regularly published and updated. It was the first edition of the book was published in April of this year, and we have our next edition coming up in October. The book is published by Thomson Reuters, and so we are just so excited to be part of this wonderful industry.
For me, the passion in this industry was just contagious. I went to AUVSI, I believe it was the Atlanta show, and I knew a bit about drones and had done a bit of, in the drone law space, but just the passion that folks have, the excitement in this industry, it was just absolutely contagious. So, I immediately became attracted to it. I co-authored Drone Law with Zaida. She focuses her sections on the regulatory, mostly federal stuff. I focus on state tort law, constitutional concerns, Fourth Amendment, things like that, which is very interesting to me. And so my background is largely in complex litigation, but working with drone clients to help minimize risk, minimize liability, help them with planning ways to minimize risk in package delivery, things like that. So
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, we're going to jump right into, remote ID in its simplest terms for those of you in the audience, really a digital license plate for the drone that is essentially up for broadcast from the drone. I actually sat in on the rulemaking committee back in 2017, so it's very timely that we're having this discussion. And maybe we'll start here with Zaida, and maybe you can give us some background on remote ID and kind of your thoughts on remote ID and its implementation.
So sure. So I'll just define what remote ID is. Basically, it's the ability of a drone in flight to transmit location and identification information to others. The drone ID deadlines for manufacturers went into effect last year and are going into effect this year also, depending on what type of remote identification compliance manufacturers are doing. So for remote identification modules, the deadline was April of 2021, and for standard remote identification, the deadline is coming up just around the corner here. It's really after September 16, 2021. But as some of you may know, for standard remote identification, just on Monday, the FAA is going to be giving a little bit of leeway on that, and I can discuss that a little later.
Thank you so much, Zaida. Tyler.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me about remote ID, and Zaida may want to cover this as well, but it was recently upheld as constitutional in the Brennan v. Dixon case out of the Court of Appeals for the Washington, D.C. Circuit. And basically what the petitioner argued there is he challenged the rule on a few grounds, one of them being that it amounted to kind of constant and continuous surveillance. So, law enforcement, they can view certain activity in public, but once it becomes continuous and constant surveillance, they're going to come into that Fourth Amendment space and need some kind of warrant or warrant exception. What the petitioner in that case basically said was that, hey, we have to broadcast the entire time we're in flight. This is that sort of constant and continuous surveillance that the Fourth Amendment deals with. And what the court said is, well, it's inherently temporary. It's only when the drone is in flight. Drone flights are comparatively rare to other types of activity. They actually looked at specifically recreational flights and the statistics with which how often and how frequent recreational flyers will fly their drone. Interesting that they did not look to commercial, perhaps because there's a lack of data out there. So remote ID is a very interesting topic. Like Zaida said, the FAA has given some leeway recently. It was just upheld. It's going to be, along with BVLOS, those are going to be very interesting developments.
It almost seems that the fact that that it was upheld, that almost caught the FAA by surprise, quite frankly, that maybe they thought that it was going to get overturned, and therefore, the kind of the implementation of that may have slipped a bit. So maybe Zaida, you can go into a little bit more detail that you kind of touched on a little bit earlier.
Sure. Yeah, that was. I think it did catch some people by surprise, but it was just upheld, Ken, in July of this year. And so, fortunately, though, in just this past August 11th, I believe, the FAA accepted a means of compliance for remote identification. And that means of compliance applies to both remote identification broadcast modules and standard remote ID. And because the FAA just accepted that means of compliance in August, like I mentioned earlier, on Monday, they seem to be giving us a little bit of leeway for standard remote identification compliance. And I'll mention, let me just let the audience know what that ASTM standard is, because I think it's very helpful for manufacturers to know it so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel, since we now have an accepted means of compliance. And that is ASTM standard F3586-22. So because it was just accepted, the FAA is giving until December, giving a little bit of leeway until December for compliance with the standard. And like I said, that is just for compliance with the remote identification standard for standard remote identification, not for the broadcast modules. So, this is the FAA's exact words were that it will exercise its discretion in determining how to handle any apparent non-compliance, including discretion to not take enforcement action. And that is for non-compliance occurring before December 16th of 2022. So that's very good news for manufacturers, because we now have 3 months of leeway.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think, one of the challenges we've had in this industry for some time is kind of predictable outcomes. And, a lot of people invest in these, like OEM manufacturers and so forth. And I think, starting to see more performance-based standards coming out from ASTM really start helping this industry kind of move forward and kind of see those investments come to fruition. So, Tyler, you had mentioned earlier about, kind of your focus on safety and mitigation. Maybe you can talk a little bit about like remote ID and what it means to those particular areas.
Sure. One thing that's interesting, in California and a handful of other states, you can actually sue a John Doe. And, a lot of certain claims, for example, if you're injured, they're going to have what's called a statute of limitations. So, you might have 2 years to bring a claim if you are injured in a car accident or in a drone accident. What you can actually do in California is you could sue John Doe if you don't know who that person is that injured you. You don't know who the operator is. And that gives you some additional time to investigate and amend your complaint to add that person. So it'll be very interesting to see how remote ID, translates into providing people who are injured or who are not injured, but may be bothered by drone flights, repeated drone flights, low altitude drone flights. There are a handful of other concerns for operators to keep in mind, especially in residential areas. Those getting into package delivery or other types of industries. You want to be aware of things like trespass, nuisance. A big area for nuisance in the drone space is vehicle noise. And also invasion of privacy. And invasion of privacy is different from nuisance and trespass because it's not so much about being in the airspace above someone's property as it is about using that camera to view private activity, or this might not necessarily be a camera, could be a microphone as well. So interesting things for folks to keep in mind.
Yeah, I always, comes to mind to me for things like, you brought up liability, and liability is going to be an interesting place moving forward. I think about kind of the topics you just mentioned. If you have somebody, for example, in a state DOT that's flying a drone doing an inspection, and they, God forbid, have an accident, the impact of that almost looks to me like another NTSB type of investigation. Where does that liability fall? Who gave them the authority to fly? Was it Lance? Lance seems to me almost like acting like an ANSP, probably 4 letters the FAA doesn't want to use. But that's really what they're kind of providing, is they're giving those access, to those areas for these drone operators. And so a lot of the things you mentioned, I think, are going to be really telling how this all starts unfolding over the next few years. Zaida, anything else to add on remote ID or?
Well, sure. So one concern has been with the general public is, of course, privacy issues, right? So, but and for the industry, that has been a concern. Now, very interestingly, so one way the industry can protect itself with privacy issues is instead of broadcasting a serial number, for standard remote identification, you can broadcast a session identification. So that is helpful. And now, as far as the public is concerned with privacy, the only information, the information that is available to the public remains unchanged. It is the same information that is currently available with the registration requirements for both small UAS and traditional aircraft.
Thank you so much. Any thoughts, as we progress down this path on remote ID, today we have broadcast, a lot of people looking at network ID. And there are some discussions about, is it one or the other? Will they have to do both? Any thoughts on how the evolution of remote ID that you see kind of moving forward from the broadcast piece?
Sure. Right. It may just become network remote identification. So we may add on to it. I do see that as a real possibility. There were, of course, people who were upset that it is just broadcast now. But I think the FAA was concerned about the proliferation, certainly, and with ADSB out, which is very, very limited. It's only allowed for type certified drones and when you're flying under Part 91. So, but I do see this is just, I believe this is just the first step, and it will develop.
Tyler, any comments from you?
Yeah, I think that we're at a crossroads here where there's not enough data from industry really to convince folks, of one way or another. But we're at that point where we kind of need to take that leap, right, in order to get the data. And I was looking just last night. There's a couple Fourth Amendment cases involving law enforcement searches of drones now that have reached the appellate level, one out of Michigan and the other out of Indiana. And the Michigan court, they basically took a position that a drone flight over your property is exceptional and inherently trespassory. So there's an inherent trespass nature to it, which to me reminds me of when the automobile was first introduced and people were yelling, "Get a horse." It's anytime, some revolutionary new technology comes into play, there's folks that are going to be very resistant towards it. I think remote ID is a decent step forward towards providing the ability for the public to kind of accept this. Whether we're doing a good job in the industry of educating the public is probably another question. I think that the industry is ready, and we're kind of hoping that other folks will get ready. I think we need to do a bit more to educate folks and to let them know that this technology can be delivered safely. It can be, it is scalable. It is something that, we can adopt safely and into the national economy. But I think it's a fascinating time, and it'll be really interesting to see, where the pressure points are in terms of resistance.
For sure, we're at a little bit of an advantage up here in New York. One of the airports that we operate out of has MQ-9s on the military side taking off next to commercial aircraft. It's the only airport in the country that occurs at, and so this community up here has been very adoptive of the drone infrastructure and the drone capabilities for some time. So I feel like we're a little spoiled up here. But I think you bring up something really interesting, and that is you have obviously the FAA that has kind of national domain over this. But there are certainly some state rights that we're starting to see. And so, for example, we here in the state of New York, we have a lawsuit now with a small drone company based in New York City based on a 1948 navigation rule about where you can take off and land in the city of New York. And so we're starting to see some real tension building. And maybe you guys can discuss a little bit about kind of the navigation rules and how you see that potentially evolving.
Yeah, and it's interesting. That case, I think it's XIZMO. I'm not sure how to pronounce. That's the name of the company.
I think Zymo. I think they call it Zymo.
Zymo. Okay, yeah, it's a media production company, and essentially they wanted to do some filming in that area. Now the law, contrary to what I hear, is the law does not say don't fly in New York City. The law says takeoff and landing is prohibited. However, apparently there's some things on the city's website that say if you see a drone in New York City, call 911. And it says drone flying in New York City is prohibited. And so basically, whether the law says that or not, it seems like they're trying to enforce that. Interestingly enough, they talk a lot about BV loss in that case, because if you can't fly beyond visual line of sight and you can't take off or land anywhere in the city, you're effectively prohibited from flying, even though that's not what the law says. So what happened very recently is the New York, I think it's the Eastern District of New York, allowed that lawsuit to proceed. They denied the government's motion to dismiss, essentially saying that there's the potential for that this creates an effective ban, and the court's going to need to hear more information as to whether you can fly, what the restrictions actually are. There's a few places in New York, I believe, maybe 2 in Queens and 2 in Brooklyn, where you can take off and land. But can you, without operations beyond visual line of sight, can you fly anywhere in Manhattan? That's a fascinating question.
Yeah, we definitely, so we do a lot of work with the public safety agencies here in the state and help them kind of get their operations. And we've seen FDNY do some operations down there. But what's been interesting for us is MTA, Port Authority are all looking to be able to do some other capabilities with drones, and they're flat out denied to be able to do this as well. So, it's interesting to start seeing even the public, but also the private agencies kind of start challenging the rules that are out there, and how that's going to start evolving over time. Zaida, any thoughts from you on this?
Yes, I am absolutely fascinated by these issues because they deal with some very interesting constitutional issues like preemption, right? So the U.S. has sovereignty over its airspace, and we have the FAA that regulates that airspace. Now, traditionally, takeoff and landings have been governed by local governments. So it is a very interesting constitutional issue, and we're following it closely because we want to see what the outcome of that case is. So it's a bit of a wait and see.
Yeah, we are really closely monitoring because for us, as Tyler mentioned earlier, obviously the DOT or the state can make rules about the landing for takeoff and landing and so forth, whereas the FAA, as you mentioned, manages the airspace. But here's property owners by the Port Authority, by the MTA, where they own the property and they still have the issue with the state. So I think there's going to be some very interesting, and it's interesting to see that happen right here in our own backyard, albeit New York City, kind of one of the last places I think we'd probably expect drones based on, kind of where New York's position and kind of its history there. And also the ability, and we talk about 5G capability and what we're doing with OpenGen, 5G is going to be really critical in cities like that. So, what do you think the answer to this is going to look like? I mean, many other cities, the state of Florida has come out and started talking about what specific drones that they're going to allow their agencies to fly. They're looking to Blue UAS 2.0 to be able to fulfill those. What do you think about other states? Do you see other states also having similar issues that we're starting to see kind of bubble up here in New York?
Texas recently had a law that prohibited certain UAS operations flying over critical infrastructure things like that was actually struck down on constitutional grounds, because while it provided exceptions for commercial operators, which is a good thing, it did not provide any First Amendment exceptions for news gathering. And so the court held that law was not narrowly tailored and actually struck it down. So states are going to have to be careful in crafting their exceptions to these laws as well. Nevada and Oregon both have kind of a low altitude civil action for trespass, where if someone flies over your property at under 250 feet, I believe it's 250 feet in Nevada, Oregon does not have a specified altitude, you can warn them. And if they fly over your property again, you can bring a civil action for trespass against that operator in both Nevada and Oregon. And, those, they do exempt commercial operators, but neither of those exempt, First Amendment news gathering. So it'll be very interesting to see. Right now, the federal government does not preempt the entire field of UAS. They've left open the door for states. That was from the Singer case out of Singer versus Massachusetts, I believe, and it was also reconfirmed in this recent case involving New York City. So they left the door open. They have not entirely preempted this field. It'll be interesting to see if that evolves, if they do decide to preempt it entirely, and that may be something that would provide uniformity across the states for industry. I know someone trying to grow a national business, maybe a UPS or an Amazon, is going to have to deal with regulations from state to state, as they would for last mile trucks. They have to deal with differences in the law from different states and these municipalities there as well. But that'll be one area of evolution we'll be looking for, is whether the federal government decides to preempt this field entirely.
Yeah, I mean, federalism, preemption are definitely hot topics that have been for a long time. I always find it interesting when they set these like 250 feet, because I, as a person standing in my yard, I don't know what 250 feet looks like. It might be 100 feet, it might be 300 feet, but I'm just guessing. And so really to support that's going to be really challenging to prove that out, that somebody did actually come within that distance, And then was it yesterday we saw the DIG Act pass the House. Now it's on to the Senate, but that's the drone inspection infrastructure grant. Now you're going to start seeing cities and municipalities all going after dollars from the federal government to perform the operations you just talked about. So maybe Zaida, on the kind of the national level, how do you think this is going to play out? I mean, you see a lot of friction coming from the states and the federal government in this case.
I think it'll continue to play out, and I think it's very important for operators to be aware of all the local, municipal, and actually down to homeowners associations regulations. So it's crucial for operators to be aware of their operating environment, to know, when an adjoining city may allow a drone takeoff from just about anywhere, but the city you're now flying in may not. And so it's convoluted, and people just have to, I guess, fly with caution.
So what you're telling me is the homeowners associations, those managers all better start watching what's happening in New York City so they can understand how to do this, and that there's a lot of work coming for law firms in terms of how to manage this interaction of the drone with the communities that are bound to start seeing drones deliver these things. I also think, Tyler, you touched on something earlier, in that, there's community perception on this. And I think, part of the challenge of the drone industry is we hear a lot about, drone deliveries, and people think about that as being, well, I want to order something from, get like a personal delivery, like a consumer delivery. But I think there's, that the community can be more engaged and more accepting when they think about this as like solving healthcare equality problems or help providing infrastructure. I think about in the terms of when you're doing a bridge inspection, for example, with the drone, you think about that's cost effective and it's saving a lot of money, that you're not having a $500,000, bucket truck out there. But there are other things. So for example, New York State has a $14 billion congestion problem, and that doesn't include New York City. And that's solely due to unplanned lane closures. So when you think about all of that information, that being able to perform that, not having to do road closures, you think the public's going to be very accepting of that, because it actually helps commerce. Just some quick statistics. the state of New York does $1.3 trillion worth of goods a year that are shipped across the state. 70% of those by trucks. So we have a 30% shortage of truckers. So how do we start complementing some of those pieces using, drones and this type of capacity? I think broader community acceptance will happen when they start understanding and seeing those benefits that actually you, the everyday person, can say, I'm not ordering my coffee to be delivered by a drone, but the fact that they're now moving to bridge inspection with drones are going to save me from sitting in traffic unexpectedly for hours and greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a lot of those benefits. And maybe we'll go to you, Tyler. You can talk about how you see the community start seeing, or some of the things maybe this industry should start doing or thinking about from a legal perspective that'll help enable some of those communities to be more accepting of that.
Every annoying tech company from Silicon Valley that makes apps for our phones talks about how they want to change the world and make the world a better place. And what you touched on is there are some folks in the drone space that are doing that and that can actually do that. They can solve real world problems, congestion and traffic, that can provide for equitable and emergency distribution of medical equipment, from defibrillators to, equitable distribution of vaccines. I know that's something that UPS is big into, working with Zipline over in the African states. And, this is an exciting time. And I think it's a bit unfortunate that even, Zaida and I, who are in this space, we learn about some of these things when we go to these shows. We learn about, these guys are doing this great thing to deliver, medicines, to deliver, life-saving equipment and things like that. And I think that in the perception of the public, drones are basically going to be used for two things. One is, consumer product package delivery, and two is recreation, as people driving around looking at stuff. And I think when we educate the public, we need to educate them on the use cases, the fact that you don't have to fly a manned helicopter in some of these areas. You don't have to deal with the noise and the risks associated with that. That you can conduct inspections of things, like power lines. In Northern California, obviously, they had a lot of fires caused by, some issues with the lines over the years. So there are a lot of ways that drones can save lives and improve lives. And I think that, educating the public on those specific things, and I think, also getting them excited for package delivery will help the industry, and that will help public acceptance. But I think there's a lot more that the public should be hearing about from, the folks doing really exciting work in this industry.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're the only UAS designated test site at an airport, and all of our waivers are basically going back under review now by environmental, and basically looking for noise pollution. I'm like, we're at an airport. Aircraft and helicopters are taking off, and you're worried about drones. So, Zaida, I want to get kind of your take on that, and then we have a question from the audience that I want to jump to. So maybe you can follow up with Tyler, and we'll jump into the question from the audience.
Sure. And, I'm certain that Amazon and Walmart and anyone else just using the drones for business purposes, for package delivery, for transporting organs, they're not interested in peeking in your window and seeing what you're doing. So some of these privacy concerns, I think, will be alleviated once the public realizes that business wants to use drones to be more efficient, not to spy on people, not to look in. So the intention, certainly from the commercial industry, is not to invade privacy. It is just to enhance transportation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. I think that, you're using the camera to actually help maneuver and operate the drone, not for peeking into people's, backyards and so forth. So we have a question from the audience. We'll jump to that. I'm just going to read it off in case you haven't seen it. But it's, how do you think aviation regulations will impact other automation use cases? And is aviation setting precedents? So Zaida, we'll start with you on that.
Sure, I think in many ways it is, because and here's, I think aviation with drones may be safer actually than automated ground transportation, and that may be because, and we'll have to see how this plays out, but that may be because there's frankly just more space in space. So there's more levels for transportation. We're not limited to just one surface. So I think that can help. And in certain ways, I think we are more advanced than ground automation. And especially with, you know, the Matternet just obtaining type certification. That is a huge step for the industry. And I think, you know, there's other companies that are right behind the Matternet. So before the end of the year, I expect to see more type certification for drones. And that has been a long process for these companies. And like I said, a huge step, I believe, in the right direction for our industry.
More before the end of the year. That's a bold statement. It's only taken us 2.5 years for the first one, but we'll see if we get a few more.
Right. But we have the noise certification standards now, which was, you know, one of the last steps. So, you know, I'm certainly hopeful.
And Tyler, what do you think about the questions that we got posed from the audience here?
Yeah, and you know, I saw a question pop up that was similar, and it said, "What metrics, you know, should folks use in determining safety?" And you mentioned ground automation. We have automation in so many facets in the United States and in our economy. We have for so many years, and a lot of it has been done incredibly safely. We know that manned aviation has been, you know, relatively safe in the United States for a long time. But I think that folks need to, because, you know, until drones are a little more ubiquitous, we're not, maybe we don't quite have the flight hours and the data there, but, you know, maybe we do, because I think what the public hears is that drones are coming. In a lot of ways, they're already there. They're you know, they are being flown in many different use cases right now, in many different industries. And I think we can look at those flights, you know, whether they're government, power line inspections, you know, agriculture. We can look at that data. We can also look at data from automation in general. And, you know, how safe is that in comparison? How has automation made our factories safer in the United States, you know, compared to when it was almost an entirely manned process? I think there is data out there. I'm a data guy. I need data. I'm not really convinced as much by emotions. So there will be folks who are convinced by emotions. And I think for them, hearing about the job creation, the exciting opportunities in the industry, you know, the new tech, economic growth, that's maybe where they need to go. For me, I need the data. And I think we can look to automation in general to try and give us an idea of how safe this is. And I think people will find that it's reasonably safe.
Sure, I think, you know, I'm going to add my 2 cents. Let me just say I'm not a lawyer, but I think, you know, I do think aviation will set precedent. I think here's where the difference. If you think about autonomy and autonomous vehicles that are terrestrial based, they're interacting with pedestrians, bicycles, and all these other things. And, you know, you've got a new Tesla next to a 1965 Mustang that's not really, you know, modernized, right? So those aren't really active participants in this ecosystem. And I think when you see things like remote ID, that forces active participation. And so what you're able to do, because the airspace is easy to digitize when you have active participation, you know, emitting things and broadcasting and doing things to be part of that system, it creates an opportunity for us to really say, this is how we look forward to this evolution of this space. And we learn that we can apply this. You know, when prior to joining NUAIR, when I was with GE Aviation, we helped develop Ohio's UTM corridor, which happened to sit right on top of an automotive manufacturing's test site. And we always thought that the UTM would essentially apply directly to terrestrial-based applications as well. There's really, it's supply chain logistics management. You know, it's a clearinghouse of time to deliver and interact with other modes of transportation. That distribution centers that are today 18-wheelers or you know, transport vans will now have trains and drones and AAM all interacting with them. And so I do think it will set precedents for how all these things actually evolve to being more of a connected environment.
And it's a chance to improve the technology in a space that, like Zaida said, it's just not quite as crowded. You know, there are a lot of things in the sky. There are a lot of things to avoid. But I think it's not only a chance to set precedent, but to improve, you know, the technology of autonomy so that it can handle, you know, the ground level obstructions and the non-participants in the space.
So we have a lightning round. We have one more question and we have 3 minutes. So each of us are going to get a minute. The question is privacy questions really more about data collected than about the drone presence? So Zaida, we'll start with you.
Is privacy? I didn't hear the whole question.
It's is the privacy question is really more about data collected than about the drone presence. In other words, is
Well,
it go ahead.
it might be both, right? The concern is it could be from the person, let's say at home. The concern could be both what's being collected and what's being invaded, that trespass. What is the trespass that is occurring? So that has been, and interestingly, Tyler and I are hearing more concerns about privacy than safety. People seem to be more concerned about who's watching me, and like the question addresses, what data is being collected. Um, so, and as far as in case the person who asked the question is concerned about what data is being collected while the drone is broadcasting with remote identification, if the question goes to that, um, well, it's not what's broadcast is really things like the latitude and longitude of the drone, the control station, the velocity. Um, it's more for safety purposes, for law enforcement, than anything else. It's really like a license plate in the sky.
Tyler.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, because I think the fear is, let's say you live in a residential neighborhood, a suburb, an HOA, lots of package delivery coming. They are they seeing, do I have a swimming pool? Do I have a doghouse in my backyard? Are they going to, if it's a large company, are they going to target ads directly to me? Are they, what information are they gathering? Do they know how many, kids I have and the approximate ages of those kids? That is a great question. Traditionally, you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy from, occasional aerial flyovers at relatively high, I guess, in the drone space, relatively high altitudes. And we know that from some Fourth Amendment jurisprudence involving, maybe they're going to fly over a backyard to see if somebody's growing marijuana. That was a big landmark case for the Supreme Court. It's going to be really interesting to see the Fourth Amendment cases, because a lot of how we define an expectation of privacy from drone observation and drone surveillance is going to come out of those law enforcement search cases. And I think that's going to help define, what's considered a reasonable expectation of privacy from, data collection from those companies, because, data is the commodity. And for many of it, that, we are the, we're the product, but really the data buyers are the consumers sometimes. So, fascinating question. Very interesting.
Well, we've been given a little bit of an extension here since we started a little bit late, so I'm gonna unpack a can of worms on this one. So when I think about this particular question, I think about the rulemaking, like we're here to talk about policy and rulemaking. I sometimes wonder if the FAA has the right CTO organization to actually interpret this new technology. Everything they've built out today has been on-prem, private network, basically based on their requirements. In the UTM and drone world, it is now a federated or internet type of model. And I sometimes wonder if they actually have the right organization to actually interpret those rules. Like, I don't see a CTO organization within the FAA that actually can interpret how do you manage privacy amongst, the evolution of a UTM and this data that we're going to start seeing traversing these networks. And so when I walk outside, I just assume that because I'm outside, everything's happening from this point forward. It's public data. It doesn't matter if my backyard or front yard. And so what I'm wondering from inside out, do we have the right people within the agency actually looking at this data to put the right rules around how this federated marketplace, you might have, not to use specific names, but you may have, carrier one like an Amazon or like a Wing, and now they have to exchange data. And then there's also people that are, photographing for real estate markets that are now in this same system. And so how do we start policing all of that data? And that's where I think my focus is on the associated elements that come together, and how the rules will be put in place for that. So since we have a few more minutes and I really unpacked that one, maybe I can get some thoughts from you on that.
Yeah, just briefly, I think one thing I found, and this is that there are some absolutely amazing people who work at the FAA, but I think one thing we'll find is that industry is always a bit more creative, they're going to find some ways to package this data, to profit from this data, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It sounds like a scary thing. It may or may not be, and I think that if you try and if you're as regulators, if you're overly prophylactic, if you're overly trying to prevent things, that stifles industry. There has to be a balance that's stricken at some point. So I think that, like the auto industry, like a lot of new technology, these problems are going to probably present themselves before, a lot of effective regulation occurs. So, I think that it's going to be an evolving issue. I think the FAA has done a good job anticipating a lot of problems. Remote ID is an anticipatory solution to a problem that a lot of folks are concerned about. So I think they're doing a good job, but it'll be fascinating to see where it goes.
Yeah, I think regulatory always lags technology, right? You got to learn from, like you said, the data. So Zaida, why don't you take us home from here? What are your thoughts on that? You'll close us out.
Sure. So this is a developing industry, and it appears that sometimes the industry has developed more quickly, certainly, right, than the regulations. So the industry is in one spot, and the the FAA is in many aspects playing catch up because it's because the FAA has to concern itself with so many other issues, with all the legal ramifications that we've been discussing. So I think we have to give this time to develop. And I think there's got to be a lot of collaboration between industry and government because we've discussed so many broad issues here, from local governments all the way up to the U.S. government. So what I think we're going to need to see, and what we've seen thus far, is collaboration, and we just need to keep that going forward.
I couldn't agree more. I think, first of all, I want to thank both of you. We could actually talk about this stuff all day long because there's so much activity happening in this space right now. But I want to thank all the listeners today. Appreciate the time. Thank you both, Zaida and Tyler. Everybody have a fantastic afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the panels.